Okay, welcome to TG2Chat Live, the live stream series from Teachers Going Gradeless. In today's episode, I have the privilege to learn from Paul P.L. Thomas. Paul is a first-year writing instructor and educational foundations instructor. He taught secondary ELA methods. He teaches upper-level writing and graduate literacy at Furman University in South Carolina. Paul is a recipient of the NCTE 2013 George Orwell Award and is the author of the blog Radical Eyes for Equity. He has written books recently titled How to End the Reading War and Serve the Literacy Needs of All Students, Teaching Writing as Journey, Not Destination, and Trumplandia, Unmasking Post-Truth in America. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to dive into how grading creates inequities in education and its impact on both students and teachers. So let's go ahead and get started. So your work as an educator has been founded on equity, and your blog really kind of the title of your blog encapsulates who you are as a person. And you've been focused on this for a long time. So in your opinion, what is equity? Why is it important to be intentional to build spaces in schools that promote more equity for learners?
Right, I would say that it's kind of been an interesting development for me because I came out of a pretty racist background, my home, my community, and I think it was really, college for me was a real turning point, and I think that it was very eye-opening, and both my awareness of sort of white privilege and racism and inequity happened about the same time that I decided to teach. And although I was pretty naive, I entered teaching with two pretty strong commitments. One was to teach students to write well. I've been very strongly focused on teaching students to write. I started out as a high school English teacher for 18 years, and I've been at the university level for 19. But also, very early on, I was aware of the need to address equity sort of in what I exposed my students to. So there was a lot of diversity compared to other people. There was a lot of diversity in the sort of literature that I had my students read. I introduced a significant amount of Black authors very early on. And it was just, to me, early on, it was an awareness that I needed to expose people to ideas and to things that I had not been exposed to, because I did teach in the same high school that I attended. So I felt like these students were a lot like me. So to me, I try to stress to students always to focus on equality. And for me, equity is the idea that people receive what they need and what they want, as opposed to, for example, I have problems with like standardization, like standards, and saying that all students need X. And that's sort of the focus of the reading book that you mentioned. Is there's a move right now to say that all students must, and it's a very phonics-driven argument. And I tend to focus on starting with the student, and what does the student need, what does the student want, and make sure the student gets that. And for me, that's equity, is that particularly in our public institutions like public schools, we make sure that students get what they need, which in society, we don't have those structures. We tend not to do that. And I think that schools, it's very hard for schools to overcome social equity, but I do think we have an obligation to sort of model that and give students a sense of what that can be. Although I do remain pretty skeptical that schools by themselves will change dramatically social inequity.
And so what are some ways that you see, or some areas that you find inequities hiding in schools? Obviously, the grade book is one of those, but what are some other ways that you see inequities hiding in schools?
Yeah, I would say definitely grades are a huge part of it, but also just what courses we allow students to have access to. One thing that's sort of a myth is that we quit tracking many years ago, and the truth is that we never stopped tracking. And also the truth is that schools are far more likely to reflect society than to offer a different version of society. So basically, children enter school at different points in their development and their experiences, and then they are almost immediately placed into a track based on that. And then you find, and I taught in AP courses. I taught AP courses. And that's a part of tracking. I mean, we some students get access to it, some students don't. And one thing that we tried to do when I was teaching high school is we really pushed more students in than would have been allowed to be. We didn't gatekeep. We had way more students in our AP courses statistically, percentage-wise, than other schools did. So I'd say tracking, grades, especially standardized testing, is deeply inequitable. Almost all standardized testing is still strongly correlated to socioeconomic status. There's great gender inequity in standardized testing. One thing I point out, except for the writing section, the reading or the verbal and the math section of the SAT, every year it's been given, on average, males score higher. So there's a huge gender inequity in the SAT, which is a gatekeeping mechanism for making it into college. So I'd say, tracking, standardized testing, and also sort of our traditional approaches to testing in classes. It's sort of built into that. Probably the other largest form of inequity is the discipline system, and who is disciplined and how severely they are disciplined. Although I was very unhappy with education under Barack Obama, one thing that he did emphasize through Office of Civil Rights was the inequity and discipline. And regretfully, that disappeared the last 4 years. And I'm a little hopeful that maybe in the next 4 years we'll return to addressing that.
Yeah. So this is kind of why I got you here. I happen to notice that you published a piece, which I absolutely loved, Grades Tarnish Teaching as well as Learning. And you have been critical of grades and grading for some time now. As a matter of fact, you contributed to a book called Detesting, Degrading, and I can't remember the full title, and I remember reading that a few years ago. But your piece focuses on this need to be transparent as an educator. So why is it important for educators who want to eliminate an idea of grading, but still have to give a grade at the end? Why is it important for us to be as transparent as possible? And what are some ways that you try to be transparent in your pedagogy?
So this has been very interesting for me. One thing I like to emphasize, because I've been taken to task on this a few times, even by some of my good friends in higher ed. I started detesting and degrading while I was a public school high school teacher in rural South Carolina in the 80s and 90s. Very, very quickly, I stopped giving traditional tests. And gradually, I quit grading major assignments, specific essays. And one thing that I've written a great deal about in the real world, I do admit probably what most of us are doing is delaying grades, which I think is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm not judging that. I do that. I do have to give grades in courses, but I do not grade any assignments at all. When I was teaching high school, that really was not as controversial or as difficult as it might seem. Students didn't seem that upset with it, had very little problems with parents, didn't have much trouble with administration. They kind of trusted me. So it really wasn't that big of a problem, but I did spend a good I'd say 10 or 15 years of that time learning how to do this. Part of it is what I learned there was having minimum expectations. So essentially, early on, I established in classes, one of the ways to be transparent was, these are the things you must participate in or you will not get credit for this class. And huge thing for me then was I had full administrative support. Early on, though, I also told students, if you do all the work, I guaranteed students they would pass. For rural kids in South Carolina, for many of them, that was an awesome agreement. I had students who were excited about that, and generally, students found out if they participated in revision, if they did what I asked them to do, if they kept working on their essays, many students made the highest grades they've ever made because I did not hold students accountable for the early versions of assignments. So whatever they eventually earned on a paper was their grade. And honestly, that process at the K-12 level worked really, really well. The weird thing for me was the transition to higher ed. And I'm in a selective private university where students mostly come in as A or AB students. So in the last 19 years, I've really had to refine what I mean by transparency and a few things that I've conceded. I tell students at any point, we can conference about what their grades would be. So if a student wants to come to me and say, what would the grade be on this paper at this point, I will discuss that. I won't do it in writing. I won't do it by email. I will do it as a discussion. Also, students do come to me and say, what is my status in the course right now? I tend to talk in things like, you're in a B range right now, or you're already in an A range, or you're in a low B, maybe in a C range. And I'm kind of surprised not as many students take advantage of that as they should, or as I expected. But I do conference so that they don't feel nervous. One thing that's really different about K-12 teaching and college teaching is when you have students for 180 days over a year, you have a long enough time to build trust. In a college course, you may have 3 months, and it's harder for them to trust you that this is in their best interest. I tend to have really good luck with students at the college level who come back to my courses because they understand what we're doing. Some other things that I've started doing too is I give some guidelines in that particular blog. I give some guidelines of what I typically see in A work, what I typically see in B work, and that's the only two I really talk about. Honestly, at the level of students that I teach, I have A's, I have B's. A few students, against my better wishes, end up with C's, but then it's generally A's and B's are people who fail. On a rare occasion, I have students who just simply won't participate in the minimum expectations, and I'm pretty adamant about not budging on that. To me, the biggest thing that's really key to this and transparency is the concept of minimum expectations. And that's something that I started doing many years ago, and I've refined it, but that's something I still pretty much live by.
Yeah, I've minimum expectations. I do like that and try to push that in my class. I call it basically a floor and then leave the ceiling open. Yeah. So I absolutely agree with that. But make that floor really clear to your students. What is that floor that we want them to get to? And then the sky's the limit for you at that point. Now, you also talk about and you brought this up a little while ago, you talk about not grading individual assignments. How do students in your class know that they are making adequate progress in your class towards meeting learning outcomes if the assignments don't have grades on them?
Right. What I've really enjoyed about my last 10 or 15 years of teaching is, and I've been teaching writing very seriously now for like 37 years. And when I was teaching K-12, I was doing about 4,000 essays a year I was responding to by hand. At the university level, I'm very lucky because my numbers are much smaller than when I taught in high school. So I've gradually, over the years, I give less written feedback, and I've increased dramatically conferencing. And one of the weird things that I experienced, we were talking before we started about the sort of the pandemic effect on teaching. Now that we've gone to, Zoom instead of having classroom office conferences, I really like Zoom for conferencing, individual conferencing. We pull their paper right up. We talk, we look at it, and I found it to be way more effective. So they don't get grades, which I think is horrible feedback. I really don't think that helps students at all. My students get a ton of feedback, and I would say the point I would emphasize is they must get feedback that's actionable. So what I've tried to do over the years is I try to give them responses that are telling them what they should do next. How do I make this better? How do I improve? And I try to be very concrete and specific. So one thing that we do in a conference on an essay, for example, is we will punctuate, like, what are 2 or 3 or 4 revision strategies for the next draft? So we very strongly identify, and I leave a lot of the responsibility of them to like write that down or to know it. But we're very targeted, and we don't do everything. I really expect students to do 2 or 3 or 4 drafts on a paper. So I try to be. I would say the other thing, grades are kind of final, and I'm very patient. I don't mind that it takes 3 drafts to get a paper into B shape or to A shape. I think that's really fine. So students get a lot of written feedback, but they get a huge amount of conferencing feedback face-to-face, or now it's virtual face-to-face.
Yeah, I got to say that my favorite, I absolutely love meeting with my kids, video conferencing. Having in-class conferences with my kids, you always had that transitional where kids are grabbing their backpacks, getting up to leave, and then the other. But yeah, I'm hoping that after the pandemic's done, that all of my conferences with kids will be virtual, because I can really get a good conference in where we are focused on each other, and then we can just move on after that. So yeah,
right.
I
they don't have
agree.
at the college level, they don't have to leave their dorm. They don't. I mean, you're saving them 10, 20 minutes. I think they like it better too. And also, I'm lucky at the university level. I do a whole week of conferencing, and they don't have to come to class. So they do it during class time. They don't have to do it on their own time. They have other things to do on the days when they're not conferencing. All of the structure of that, I will keep after the pandemic also. I think it's really that part, and students really respond to it well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on that one. So now you've been touching on this whole time, coming up with a final grade. And like most teachers that are out there, we have to give a final grade. And we all, in this gradeless world, we're trying to figure out a way that is both transparent for our students, but also de-emphasizes grading and focuses more on the learning. So how do you come up with final grades with your students in an equitable way?
Right. I think that's really important to focus on. 2 things I would say that are important is, since I am getting a huge amount of student work throughout the semester, I am building a rubric in my head for each student throughout the semester of what grade the student deserves. So 2 concepts I think that are very important is sort of this building awareness of your students' work. But the other thing too is, don't grade someone until they've had the entire semester to learn. So I do portfolio assessment. I have students turn in work throughout the semester. We have deadlines. I don't take off points for late. There's nothing to take any points off of. I did a little calculation. 80, 90, 95% of the assignments are turned in on time, even though I don't do, taking off points or anything, because I stress to them it's really important for them to participate. So I'm building this idea in my head. What does this student deserve as a grade for this course? So I think in terms of course grades as opposed to each individual artifact, like each individual assignment. And then it really is not incredibly difficult. I sit down, their final portfolio is always all the work from the semester organized and resubmitted. So in a writing course, they can rewrite everything, of course, but some of the final portfolios are simply organizing and collecting the work they've done all semester. And I tell them that final portfolio is their argument for their grade. And for the students who are really concerned about their grades, when we meet about grade, I say, if you want an A, this is what it has to look like. And we have those conversations throughout. You know, what do you need to be able to do? And just for one very concrete example, as a first-year writing instructor, their cited essay is a big determining factor. If they can demonstrate using high-quality sources and citing correctly and doing all sort of the formatting and doing sort of sophisticated things, one thing I really stress is that they synthesize sources and don't just like use one source at a time and kind of pile them up the way they did in high school. We talk about very specific things like that. And if a student can do that, their work moves up to the level of an A. For students who still don't demonstrate an understanding of high quality sources and sophisticated integrating of sources into work or proper formatting of citation, their grade drops down into the B and maybe even into the C area. And we have those, I mean, we talk about that throughout the semester. I'm very open about that.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to do too. I mean, I'm constantly having conversations with my kids about their work and challenging them because there are certain things that they need to learn to do to be able to communicate effectively. So the last question I want to ask you, which I'm really interested in, and you talk about this a little bit in your piece, but I want to push you on this, is by not grading student work, what are some positive impacts that this makes on both students and on teachers, and creating equity not only for students, but creating equity for teachers too?
To me, the huge thing, the more I think about it, the huge thing is it creates a risk-free environment. So there's no consequences for the students to make a mistake. There's no consequences for me to make a mistake, and I do. I'm constantly coming into class and saying, you know, I messed this up when we did it. We're going to do something different, or I'm going to change how I do this. So I really think one of the biggest problems to me, probably the minute I started teaching, and especially by the time I was in grad school and got a better awareness of like critical pedagogy, was that, you know, grading. One example that I use is many of us have done the vocabulary test where you write 100 at the top of the page and then you put -4, -40, and you put a 60. And that means that students are starting assessments with 100 points they didn't earn, and they're trying not to lose points. I mean that just symbolically, that is the problem with teaching. I talk to my students; they all start with nothing. They start with nothing, and they're building their grade. And I will say, the first place I really understood that was when I was trained to respond to AP writing prompts. When they talk about, you know, when you're getting training on how to teach students to take the AP literature test, that's how they train people to grade. They have trouble with English teachers grading in AP testing situations because we're so brainwashed into taking points off as opposed to giving students credit for what they do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, you know, to me, creating an environment where risk and effort matter, and there's no negative consequences to them. And I do, you know, and I have several blogs about this. I have a joke where I say -5 when a student says something incorrect or does something wrong. And it takes students a while. I've literally had students email me after class and ask how to earn those points back. uh, and it's a joke. You know, I'm like -5. It's a joke. Like you're not losing anything because and it's sort of, you're building your, you're building your equity in this class. That's what you're doing. You're, and think of it in capital terms. And you're not losing anything. And there's always room to gain until the very end. I mean, I have students that, make incredible recovery in the quality of their work late, and I don't see anything wrong with that. Some students establish very early that they're excelling. Some students establish in the last few weeks that they're excelling, and I do not see what why it matters when that happens.
Yeah, I appreciate that you talk about this deficit mindset of grading that comes in writing. And I know myself that in the past, I've given students essays and I'm like, okay, how do I not give them 100%? And that's not true teaching and assessment. And I love the idea of asset-based assessment, where I'm looking for the positives within my students' work. And when you have that, why do you need a grade on that?
Right.
So I'm going to push you a little bit more. So how is not grading, how does that make it more equitable for teachers themselves? So we talked about students, we talked about that growth mindset for students, we talked about the asset base for students, but how is this better for teachers?
Well, I think one thing I think one problem with, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think grading is part of sort of the standardization urge, and we try to make things standard and sort of this sort of mechanical fairness that I think is kind of preposterous. This is a human-to-human endeavor. So to me, the benefit of not grading gives you even more space to do individualized instruction. I feel like I've been pretty much doing individualized instruction since almost the first day that I taught. I see each student against that student. I do not really think about students compared to other students. It just doesn't even cross my mind. I try to look very carefully at strengths and weaknesses of each student, and then I'm working from there. And to me, it doesn't matter where the student is. I'm going to take the student further, and I don't care where the student is, because once the student's handed to me, it doesn't matter where they are. So I'd say the biggest thing about degrading in the role of the teacher is it gives you a lot more room to do individualized instruction. And I think that's what we should be doing. I mean, that to me.
Yeah. And I know for me personally, like one of the biggest assets of degrading is the relationships that I have with my kids now. It breaks that barrier of where, there's always that grade that's going to, that creates the power struggle between the teacher and the student. Exactly. Whereas the student tries to appease you in order to get the grade, or the student is hiding from you and won't look you in the eye walking down the hall because of the grade. When you eliminate those things, you're now human beings having a conversation.
Yeah, I think the best thing I've added recently is I have a statement of what it's like to be in a degraded, detested class. And I've got a statement, one paragraph I think is probably the best thing I've ever provided students, is I say, I do not design assignments to evaluate you. I am designing assignments for you to learn. And that's the truth. Like, that's what I don't think of, oh, how can I find out if this student's an A student? No, my assignments are not evaluative. And I do think it reduces the antagonism. I've always felt like there was way too much antagonism between students and teachers. And I tell them, I'm there to help you. I say there, I work for you. I'm there to help you. I'm your advocate. I'm not an evaluator.
Well, so we had a question from Arthur Caravalli, my partner here. He wants to know, do you go lower than a C? Because you talked about grades earlier and coming across how you come about them. And you mentioned C's that you gave them out, disgruntledly. So do you give grades lower than C's aside from withholding credit?
No, it's pretty much, and almost all my students make A's and B's, and I'm in a selective university, but that was really pretty common when I was teaching high school. Also, if you do everything I ask you to do, I'm probably going to drag you kicking and screaming to at least a B. I give rare C's. I may not have given a D in decades because I really find that after that fall off from a C, you just haven't done the work, and that means you fail. Yeah. And I would say, yeah, you just don't get credit for the class. I have to turn in an F, but that's what it is.
Okay. Well, Paul, thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate you spending this with me. Your work with equity has been very inspiring and challenging for me as an educator. If you want to learn more about Paul and from his work, you can follow him at PLThomasEdD. His blog, radicalscholarship.wordpress.com, and he's also on Medium. I want to thank you all for joining us today on TG2Chat Live. TG2 would like to encourage you to support our efforts as we continue to help educators around the world grow beyond grades. Encourage you to become a Patreon supporter. At this time, we would like to thank our supporters and their gracious contributions that they give, which help to ensure quality content like this and more. Again, Paul, thank you very much for joining us today, and appreciate your insight.
Thank you.